Hello everybody and welcome back to the Code Wrinkles channel for a new video that I hope will bring at least one new information to you. In this video we'll talk once again about Blazor and we'll cover the topic about creating a robust data service in our Blazor application. And in my opinion this is a very important topic, and this needs to be covered, or we need to think about creating a data service right at the beginning where we start to develop a Blazor application. The reason why we really need to do that is that if we want to do it afterwards, then we will have probably to do a lot of code refactoring. And this is also not something very complicated, and we can use different techniques and patterns that we all know from programming, so that we can ensure that we can really extend these services once we need to add new features without anything else to break. And one other reason why we need to do this is right here on the screen. We see here this employee list component that we have created in a previous video. So if you want to check it out, just use the previous video button that you will see at the end of this video and you will get there. But the idea is that in this component it really doesn't happen a lot of things. However, there is a big problem, and the problem that I see here is that in this component we use the HTTP client to get the information from an API. Well, in this case it's not really an API, we just get it from a JSON file that we have in our www root folder, but the idea is actually the same. So what this actually means is that our component needs to know all the implementation details about how to get the data. And this is really not the responsibility of the component itself. A component in Blazor should only be responsible to get the data, but it doesn't really have to care how the data is fetched from APIs and so on. It just needs to get the data. So in this case, the component would just need to get an employee array and then display it in the UI. How this employee array is fetched is not the responsibility of the component, so we need to abstract this away so that our components would just be able to use a service that would give them all the information that they need without caring a lot about how that information is received or requested. So let's get started, because we have some setting up to do, and while we set up, I'll try to explain why we do certain things. So first of all, we would need a new folder here that we will call interfaces. Let's add a new folder to this project, so it would be add new folder, and let's call it interfaces. And here we'll basically need to define two interfaces. And the first interface that I guess we would have to create is for the data service itself. So let's create a new interface. Let's choose interface here, and we'll call it employee data service. And let's make it also public. And right now, what can we expose in our service would be a task of employee array, because we'll make this async. So this is why we want to return a task, and we'll call this method get all employees async, and that's basically it. But what probably we will need very soon is also a method that would give us only one employee, probably by ID. So let's create a new method that would be called task of employee. So it will return a task of employee, and it will be called get employee by ID, of course. And we have to pass in an integer that would represent the ID of that certain employee. And this is for now all the contract that we have to define in this interface. And if you ask yourself why we still need to define interfaces in Blazor, because we are running basically everything in the browser, so we don't really depend on other stuff, or no other libraries will probably use our services that we define here. And the reason why we still need to use interfaces is because, of course, we still want to unit test our application, and if we want to mock, for instance, the HTTP calls, so not to make real HTTP calls while unit testing, then of course it's really important that we have this type of interfaces. So that's why I will keep using interfaces also in Blazor. However, there is one other thing to note here. Right now we know that we have only one way to get employees, and that is by reading the employees from a JSON file. So we don't really have an HTTP API or a REST API where we can simply send a call to a get employee by ID, or so that we can get only one single employee. So in this case, we know that we see already that our data service will be also responsible to process the information that it actually gets. And right now I would like to introduce another topic, because there is another thing or another very important concept that we would need here when creating a robust data service in Blazor, and this is an HTTP client. And I don't really want to use the regular HTTP client like we have it registered right now in program.cs, like services add transient, and we simply add a new HTTP client specifying a base address. And the reason why I think that this is really not optimal is that probably in most Blazor application you would have to talk to different APIs. So in our application we could talk to our employee API from which we get our data, but I don't know, maybe we just want to also display in a ribbon a weather forecast, and we might query a weather forecast API for a forecast. So in that case we would need basically a different API with or we would need a different client with a different base address and so on. So that's why I think that it is best, when we want to create a robust data service in Blazor, to also leverage the power of HTTP Client Factory. And we all know about HTTP Client Factory. There are also videos on this channel about HTTP Client Factory that works really well in ASP.NET Core. And seeing that Blazor is built on top of ASP.NET Core, actually, HTTP Client Factory is also something that we have also in Blazor. So in this case, I would like to create typed clients for each API that we'll actually use in our application. So that's why I will add a new class here in this interfaces folder, which I will call employee API client. But also the L shouldn't be capitalized. And of course, this is an interface. So let's change that. And here in this interface we'll have just one method right now, because right now we know that we can just get employees that are read actually from a JSON file. So we get an employee array, and let's call that also get all employees. So that would be it. And we also return a task of employee array, because we will also have or want to make this method async. Let's also follow the best practices and naming conventions and name this method with async. Let me just check if I have created exactly the same thing here, also by ID async. So that is a really important stuff. So let's go right now one step further, and let's implement the HTTP client first. So for that we would need a new folder here, and this folder will be called core. And if you ask yourself why I create this core folder, there is a video here that explains how it would make sense to structure a Blazor application, and the importance of a certain core folder that would contain basically all cross-cutting concerns of our application. So that would be the data service, that would be loggers, that would be error handlers, and so on. Basically everything that we will reuse throughout our entire application. And if we do an analogy or a comparison to building a house, everything that we put in this core folder is really comparable to the plumbing and wires and the electricity in a house. So there are really services that go throughout our entire application, and we use them basically in all or through or within all the application. So let's go then one step further, and in this core folder let's create some other subfolders. And here it would be one subfolder that I will call HTTP clients, and that would be the folder where we'll put all the HTTP clients that we'll need in this application. And we'll create a new folder that I will call, in this case, services. Sorry, let's don't do a lot of typos. So in this HTTP clients, let's create a new HTTP client for our interface, and it would be a new class. This class would be called employee API client. So in this class, what we will need is, of course, we'll need a constructor, and in this we will get an HTTP client, private read-only HTTP client, and of course we need also the HTTP client to be injected here, and that would occur through HTTP client factory. We'll see that in just one second. I will do that. So here we also need the HTTP client as an incoming parameter, HTTP client client, and we have to assign the parameter to the field that we have created previously. So that would be it. And of course, our class would inherit or would implement the iEmployee API client interface. And let's just implement the interface here, and that's actually it. So right now the only thing that we could do is we can go here in this employee list component and simply take out the logic that we have here and move it to our HTTP client, or in this case to our employee API client. This is how our HTTP client is called. And what we can do here is, of course, we need to mark this as async because we need to await the call, of course. So let's simply also return that. So we want to return, and of course in this case it's not HTTP, but it's the client that we will use. So it would be get from JSON async, and I want to to get an employee array. We have of course to add this using system.net http.json, and actually everything should be fine right now. So the next thing to do is, if we have this employee API client ready, we can just go ahead and try to register register the service in program.cs. So what we will have to do is install a new NuGet package for that. And let's go to manage NuGet packages, and that would be Microsoft extensions HTTP. So it's the first one that it comes here in this list. So we can just install it. Okay, I accept. And right now our package should be installed. We see the green arrow, so everything should be fine. So right now we can go back to our program.cs file, and what we really need to do is here replace actually this HTTP client that is created here with a new HTTP client that will use the HTTP client factory. And in this case, what we can do here is simply say here, for instance, builder. So on the builder, then we need a service collection, and then we say add HTTP client. And here, of course, we have to specify some things, because this is also a generic method, and we can provide the interface iEmployee API client, and we can provide also the implementation, which is the employee API service, or the employee API client. And of course, what we can do here is configure client. Sorry. Let's make a lot of space, and here we can specify the base address. Of course, it would be a configure client dot base address, and here in this base address we can just specify what we have here. So this URI, because it's actually the exact same thing. It's the same URI that we'll have as a base address right now. So let's just copy this new URI. Okay, non-invocable member. So just 1 second. Cannot be used. Oh, of course, it's not a method. Sorry for that. Sorry for that. That was very, very bad from my point of view. Of course, it's a property. We can just or we just need to create a new URI and assign it to this base address. And right now, of course, if we don't have any typos, everything should work fine. Yeah, sorry for the small error here right now. Okay, but right now we have this new typed client, so that means that we can actually get rid of this default HTTP client that we have here, and from now on we'll use this typed client to make calls to our API, in this case just to get the information from there. And then the next thing that we could do is, yeah, well, we can think about how to create a service. So in the services folder, let's create a new class, and this class would be called employee data service. And here in this class, we will also need a constructor, and we would need also a private field that would be private read-only of type I employee API client. And let's call it also client. And of course, we can inject this through dependency injection, I employee API client, and we can then simply assign it in the constructor. Okay, and right now, of course, what we have to do is we have to implement the interface. So it would be I employee data service, and let's implement the interface. That would be implement interface. Here, the first method is, of course, we should mark it as async. It should return a task of employee array, so that should be the result. And what we can return here is just simply return await client, because the client already provides us all the employees that we need. And the power of a data service we can see here in the second method actually, because here we also have to mark it as async, but we know here that from the API we just get a list of employees. So what we can do here is say var employees equals, and then await, of course we should await, and then client dot get all employees async. But here the components or the consumers of the service would like to just get one certain employee. And this is once again the power of having a data service, because the data service knows that it can get only this data, but it can actually process the data and simply return, for instance, employees. It could look for a first or default, and then we can specify that we look for an employee that has the ID equals to the ID that we get in to this method. So this is our data service that right now gets the information, it processes the information so that it would be able to return to the component or to each consumer only the information that it needs. And in this case, the consumer would just like to get an employee and nothing else. And this is what our data service is actually doing. How it is doing, once again, it is an implementation detail and it belongs to the data service itself. So the components really don't have to care how this data is fetched. Now, before we can go and wire everything up in the UI, so in our component, we also need to register this service. So we have builder services and transient, and that would be, we can also specify here an interface I employee data service, and we can of course specify the implementation, which would be employee data service, which would be that one. So in this case, this service will be added to the dependency injection container. We also have one error, but I guess we'll fix it. Here is we found markup that has some problems. That happens in Visual Studio. Maybe it's only because I'm using the 2019 preview version, but when we'll open this markup again or that component, everything will be fine. As you can see, the error is right now gone. However, what we can do, we can go back right now in this employee list component where we need to get the data. And in this case, we don't want to inject the HTTP client, but we just need the data service. So we want to inject an I employee data service. And let's also call this property data service. Okay, and in this case, what we need to do is here simply await, and we will say data service dot get all employees async, and that should do it. So right now, if everything is okay, we should have the exact result that we had also previously. So when we run the application and when we go, when we navigate to this employee list component, we should still be able to get the entire list of employees. So let's get the application started. It fired up. It downloads the DLLs because this is a pure Blazor WebAssembly application. So everything runs in the browser. And if we go here, we see once again that we have all the list of employees exactly like we had it previously, but the only difference is that right now we are using a data service and we just made our Blazor application more robust, easier to understand, easier to read, because right now we split responsibilities between what a component should do and what a data service should do. And just to summarize what we need to create a basic but very robust data service that we can simply extend when we need to add new features is basically creating interfaces for the data service itself and for the API client that we need. Then in the core folder, we created a folder called HttpClients in which we implemented our employee API client class, which will get us the data. And then we have in the services folder created this employee data service, which will get the data, but it also knows, or it should care about how to process the data so that it would be able to present to the consumers only the information that the consumer need, without the consumer needing to take care or think about how the data is actually fetched. So everything here is abstracted away from the consumer, and only the data service is responsible to process the data that it really gets to that API. And last but not least, in order to wire everything up together, we have used HTTP client factory in Blazor to create a typed HTTP client, which is of for the interface employee API client, and with the implementation in our employee API client class. So this is the power of HTTP client factory. And then we have also added our data service, of course, to the dependency injection container. And this is why we can right now simply inject it here in our component where we need it, and just use the data service and get all the data that we need in this component. So right now, the only responsibility of this component is just to render the information that it gets from a data service in the UI and nothing more. So I'm fairly happy with what we achieved so far. If you enjoyed this video, please don't be shy and subscribe to this channel if you didn't do this already. Also, if you have other questions or feedback, or if you want to get in touch with me, don't be shy again and just drop a comment. I will be very happy to answer to you. Also, this video is part of a series, and if you want to navigate through this series in a very logical order, at the end of this video, maybe right now, you would see on the screen two overlays with the previous video in the series and with the next video in the series. So if you can just navigate using the previous video and next videos from each video to get really through all the videos in a logical order, so that you don't really miss anything. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you here for the next video. Have a nice day. Bye.